Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we're continuing work on our Phasmophobia cross-minute mashup. The last time we started adding interactivity between players and ghosts. This included the addition of ghost types and tool matches which would produce evidence for the player to discover. This allowed us to finally start the creative process of reimagining aspects of Phasmophobia in the world of Minute. It was a long and tedious process, but this little bar represented a huge step forward in our development we continue working on with today's plan. The creative interpretations continue as we attempt to translate the spirit box into a gameplay mechanic that fits in the world of Minute. And assuming we're successful, this will hopefully help us with future tools that'll require player input. And finally, we'll modify the inventory system to add specific usages for certain items. And that's the plan, so let's get to the coding. First thing up was creating a global function to check for a specific tool. This function would be based on the light check function and will be needed later on in the session. And with that done, it was time to work on the spirit box. A few new variables would be required. This collection of states and timers would be needed in order to build a sequencer. This sequence would be initiated via spacebar check. Next, a couple switches were added which would cycle through our states and timers. For the spirit box in the first state, we would initiate the countdown for a ghost reply. Then for every tool using this sequence, the second state counts down to an eventual reset. And as you can see here, there are many responses that the player can receive. In order to determine a ghost's presence via spirit box, some math would take the distance percentage we coded a few episodes ago and compare it to the image number of the text bubble sprite. So the closer the player is to the ghost, the more varied the responses would get. However, this wasn't working as I thought it would. No matter the distance, the response would always be as if the ghost didn't exist. And after a ton of time poking around, I remembered. I disabled the percentage calculations for some of the items, including the spirit box. So instead of rewriting the code, I added a new global function to determine independent distance checks, thus keeping our current code intact while also adding a universal version that'll also come in handy for future purposes. Doing this allowed us to finally get the results we were after. The player could now prompt the ghost for a response, and after some time it would provide one if within distance. Then in order to vary things up, I randomized the ghost's response. So now distance would determine how many responses the ghost can choose from. And I actually really enjoyed the results. It feels like this is the closest we can possibly get to the original spirit box in the world of Minute. But there's no time to sit around appreciating our interpretation. There was more to code. So next up, it was time to tackle the inventory changes. In the F key event, I added a new check specifically for smudge sticks. And if the player was holding one, we'd use that new global function we added at the start of the session to check for a lighter in the player's inventory. And of course, if both came back true, then the smudge stick would have its state switched to on. Testing showed this wasn't working, which is what happens when you copy/paste code without removing bits that'll, otherwise break it. So removing the unnecessary bits left us with working functionality. Smudge sticks could only be set to their on state if the player is holding it and has a letter in their inventory, much like it's done in Phasmophobia, as far as I'm aware. So with that working, I added candles to the list of lightable items, and to make sure that they couldn't be toggled like a flashlight, the smudge stick and candles were omitted from the toggle code. And there we had it, a very large step forward in our creative endeavors. Unlike the percentage bar, I really like the spirit box idea, and again, I don't think we can get much closer without going beyond the realms of Minute style. I mean, maybe an actual text box, but considering the fast-paced nature of the project, I'm trying to communicate as much as possible with using as few actual words as possible. And indeed, this sequence approach should also make other player-initiated items like the Ouija board or ghostwriting much easier to implement. Well, in theory at least. There is still definitely a lot more left to do, especially when it comes to items that directly impact the ghost's behavior. So we're far from finished on this mashup. But for now, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Let's Dev. So leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our progress in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.